Are we good?
Good. Yep.
All right. As you know, this is the video for the Psych 101, the concurrent course, and we're doing this because it's your spring break, and I hope that you have a good spring break and are having a good time. But I hope you take a little bit of time to watch the video. Obviously, I'll be glad to go over and sort of review any of the concepts that I cover, but I don't want to repeat the whole thing. This is the point of the video because you're not here this week to go over the concepts. And as I said, those folks who I assigned the questions to, and I'll mention that when I go over the questions, you get 100 because I'm sure that you would prepare. But anyway, here we go. As usual, we're going to start with the vocabulary, and then I'm going to go through the questions. Obviously, the questions are going to be a little bit different because, as you know, I like interaction, and so you're not here. I'm standing here in front of a camera. Mr. Belk has started the camera. Oh, just a couple little housekeeping things before I do jump into the vocabulary terms and then the questions that we want to cover. Mr. Belk thinks that he will have this uploaded to YouTube this afternoon, this being Friday. He's going to email me that internet address for the YouTube site. As I told you, I'm going to put this under course documents. Go to the Blackboard site and look under the link course documents. Click on that link and you'll see the address, the internet address for this YouTube site that you can view this course. Just to make sure that everybody gets it, I'm also going to send out an email on that Blackboard email site. So you should be getting that also. And also, I'm going to attach a link, and hopefully you'll be able to download that. It won't be absolutely required that you do that because I can give you that when you get back into class after your spring break. But I'm going to try to attach a link on an analysis of Maslow's hierarchy of needs that we were going to do as a group activity, but obviously, since you're not here, we can't do it as a group activity, but I still want to cover it because, hint, hint, as I usually do, this is a very, very important concept, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We not only want to look at Maslow's hierarchy, but we want to look at it in terms of application. So this little analysis is the application that we're going to do for Maslow's hierarchy. And I tell you what, so I won't get any sort of crosstalk here from out in the hall. Let me go ahead and close the door. So I'm going to step away from the camera for just a minute. All right, let's jump into the content and the next chapter that we're going into is motivation. And the first term is the term motivation. And you can see on page 333. And again, I'm assuming that you have your textbook. And if you don't have your textbook, obviously you don't need to write down these definitions. I want to elaborate on them, but as always, you can refer back to your textbook for these definitions. But you can see on page 333 that motivation is defined as an internal process that initiates, sustains, directs, and terminates activities. And motivation is one of those psychological constructs that we can't see. We know it exists because we see the consequences of motivation, but we can't directly see motivation, but we all know the effects of motivation. So for test purposes, obviously, be familiar with this general definition of motivation. Also on page 333 is the term drive. And you can see that drive is defined as the psychological expression of an internal needs or valued goals, for example, hunger, thirst, or the drive for success. And this is one of the simplest ways of looking at motivation. When you look at motivation in terms of drives, it's pretty simple, because drives are based on, as the definition said, needs. And when we are in a need deficit state, then we are motivated to satisfy that particular need. Now, when we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this is going to be an important sort of concept, the idea of drive, that we're driven, we're motivated to satisfy certain needs. Now, a term that we've talked about numerous times throughout the semester, and that's the term homeostasis. And you can see, once again, that homeostasis is defined as a steady state of bodily equilibrium. And that's important because, we assume that motivation is based on the need to reestablish this homeostasis. Once we get out of homeostasis, either psychologically or physiologically, then there's the need to get back into a homeostatic state, and that sort of prompts motivation. One of the things that we know when we look at motivation is that there are circadian rhythms. And you can see the definition of circadian rhythms on page 333. And these are cyclical changes in body functions and arousal levels that vary on a schedule of approximating a 24-hour day. That we have these cycles. We have sleep-wake cycles. We have temperature cycles. And these cycles can affect our bodily states and can affect our, in this case, level of motivation. We know, and we recently went through it with the daylight savings time, when we sprung forward, it slightly altered our circadian rhythm. And it's much easier in fall when you fall back because you feel like you actually are getting more sleep. But when you spring forward, obviously the circadian rhythm, the fact that your circadian rhythm has been changed, sort of affects you and affects your level of motivation. And I'm sure in the spring when we sprung forward, some of you, had a little more difficulty, including me, a little bit more difficulty getting up at the regular time that you did. You were sort of motivated to stay, in the bed. For test purposes, leave out hypothalamus, obviously an important organ in the body that's related to motivation and emotion, but let's not worry about that for test purposes. On page 339, a condition that I'm sure that all of you are already familiar with, but one that is a very prevalent condition in our society today, and that's anorexia nervosa. You can see the definition is active self-starvation or sustained loss of appetite that has psychological origins. And this obviously, as you probably know, affects primarily teenage girls. And the idea is there's a distorted body image that society has given girls, especially teenage girls, the idea that the ideal body type is very thin. And so they strive to achieve this ideal body type. And they feel that their body type doesn't match the ideal body type, and it gets out of hand. And even when they're physically thin, they still feel that they're fat, so they engage in this active starvation. Now, the condition is a little bit different, and I think most of you know about this condition also, and that's bulimia nervosa. And you can see on page 341, bulimia nervosa is defined as excessive eating, gorging, usually followed by self-induced vomiting and or laxative taking. So this is a little bit different, and it usually affects a little bit different age group. These, again, females are more likely to be affected by bulimia nervosa, but these are usually women in their 20s And this is the binge purge syndrome. These are women who eat a lot, then feel guilty about it, and then feel the need to purge, either through vomiting or taking laxatives and so on and so forth. Now with bulimia nervosa, many times you don't see the extreme weight loss, but something that we talked about before, when we talked about the nervous system, this can result in one sort of physiological problem, electrolyte imbalance. Remember those, when we looked at the nervous system, we talked about sodium and potassium. This can lead to sort of depletion of sodium and potassium, and if you remember, that those two are very important for that the transmission of impulses through the nervous system. So bulimia nervosa can have some significant effects, not only on the body, but also on the nervous system. Leave out sex drive. I think everybody understands there's a sex drive in humans. The need for achievement. On page 347, you can see that this is defined as the desire to excel or meet some internalized standard of excellence. And obviously all of us, to a certain extent, have a need for achievement, some more than others. And as students, this is an important concept for you, because in order to achieve your academic goals, you have to have a certain need for achievement, that internal sort of drive for excellence that propels you. When we look at motivation, psychologists can break down motivation into two basic types. And you can see on page 349, intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. And you can see that intrinsic motivation is defined as motivation that comes from within rather than from external sources. Motivation based on personal enjoyment of a task or activity. And then you can see that extrinsic motivation is defined as motivation based on obvious external rewards, obligations, or similar factors. I think just about everyone, certainly psychologists, would agree that the best type of motivation is intrinsic motivation. The type of motivation that comes from within. Instead of being forced to read a book, a person is intrinsically, they want to read a book. Extrinsic motivation obviously is necessary. Some outside sort of agent that is sort of propelling us to do certain things. In school, as an educator, I and other educators wish that we could, rely on intrinsic motivation, that students would come into our classroom and they would want to do the assignments out of the love of learning. But, that's a little bit unrealistic, and this is why we have external motivations like grades and, academic awards and so on and so forth. So, intrinsic motivation is best, and for test purposes, I'd like for you to recognize the definition. But for more than test purposes, I'd like for you to recognize that, if you can, encourage intrinsic motivation, either in yourself or in other people, ultimately that's better than extrinsic motivation. Let's flip over just a bit to emotion. We're not going to spend much time on emotion, but let's look at the definition. You can see emotion is defined as a state characterized by physiological arousal, changes in facial expression, gestures, posture, and subjective feeling. And we all know what emotion is. We see the effects of emotion, but once again, the term emotion is a psychological construct. We can't see motivation itself. We can see the effects of motivation, of emotion, and we see this played out in people's lives and their facial expressions. And it's a very important aspect of human lives and human interaction. But for test purposes, obviously, just the definition is what I want you to look at. A structure in the brain that we've looked at, we've talked about before, is the amygdala. And this is one of those very specific structures that we know affects, in this case, emotion, especially the emotion of fear. And you can see the definition on page 353, a part of the limbic system within the brain that produces the fear response. Think that earlier in the semester, I mentioned the Jose Delgado research that he did with a bull, where he put an electrode down into the amygdala of a bull's brain, and he was able to sort of control the bull's emotions, especially the emotion of fear. The polygraph, I think most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with what we mean by the polygraph. Typically we refer to the polygraph as a lie detector, but it's not really a lie detector. It's an emotion detector. And this is why the polygraph is not admissible in legal proceedings, in court proceedings, because the polygraph, and we've used the term validity and reliability. There's some validity issues and some reliability issues with the polygraph because it does record changes in a person's emotional state, but the assumption is that if a person tells a lie, they're going to have changes in their emotional state. And we know that there's some people who could be guilty and not show any emotional changes. And there's some people who were not guilty and put them in, hook them up to a polygraph, and they might have some emotional changes that the polygraph operator would interpret as not telling the truth. So there's some real issues with the polygraph. Now, we've talked about earlier, again, I don't want to elaborate too much. I promised that I would sort of cut to the chase in terms of what you would need for test purposes on this video. But you remember earlier when we talked about the nervous system and the brain, there are some attempts to look at the brain in terms of brain scans and other analyses of the functioning of the brain, so that in the future we probably really will have some true lie detector instruments based on functioning of the brain. But the polygraph certainly is not a true lie detector test, and for test purposes I'd simply like for you to know what it measures and why sometimes we interpret those changes in those measures as a person either telling the truth or telling a lie. Leave out facial feedback hypothesis. It's an interesting hypothesis. You can take a look at it, but in the interest of time, we'll just leave that out. On page 363, something that I really wish we had more time to explore, but there are a lot of psychologists who feel that we pay too much attention to intelligence quotient and not enough to emotional quotient or emotional intelligence. And you can see on page 363 that emotional intelligence is defined as the ability to perceive, understand, and manage emotions. Not only our own emotions, rage control, whatever, but to be able to interpret other people's emotions and to sort of match our emotions with other people's emotions. One of the places that really has begun to pay a lot of attention to emotional intelligence is like medical schools. We assume that people who go to medical school are very bright people, and obviously they are. But sometimes, the brightest medical students don't turn out to be the best physicians because they don't have good bedside manner. And that sort of speaks to emotional intelligence. They're able to sort of understand other people's emotions in sort of medical crisis situations and to sort of manage their own emotions in those situations and to produce more harmonious relationships with their patients and other people. So emotional intelligence is a critical component of successful living. Okay, let's jump into the questions. And if we were in class, I would be calling on Jasmine to help us, but obviously Jasmine is not here today, as she usually is. And so Jasmine gets 100. But let's look at the different types of motivation. We already broke it down into intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. But another way that you can look at motivation is in terms of biological motives, stimulus motives, and learned motives. And you can see that in the book, and I'm going to sort of elaborate a little bit. The biological motives are those motives based on our need to survive. Those survival needs. And what do we mean by these? The need for food, the need for water, those needs that we have to have in order to survive. And this is the simplest way of looking at motivation. When we flip over in just a few minutes to look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, this is going to be the basis of his hierarchy. You look at motivation and you realize that the most basic type of motivation is based on our need to be motivated to survive. And so this is what we mean by biological motives or biological motivation. Those motives that drive us to satisfy those needs that we need to survive. Now obviously this is not the only type of motivation. Another type of motivation is what psychologists refer to as stimulus motivation or stimulus motives. And this is our motivation to get information, to acquire knowledge, to keep our brains active. For instance, if you're motivated to read a book, or you're motivated to go to a movie, that motivation certainly is not a biological motivation or biological motive, because if you don't read the book, or you don't go to the movie, or you don't, go to the video arcade, Dave & Buster's or whatever, you're not going to die. But we need that constant flow of stimulation for the brain that provides us with information and knowledge. In the case of Dave & Buster's, entertainment. It keeps our brains active, and that's what we refer to as stimulus motivation. Another type of motivation is learned motivation. This is the type of motivation that we pick up from the society in which we live. And what we mean by learned motivation is that we learn that there are certain things that we do that will sort of result in many cases, rewards, recognition of achievement, accolades, praise from others. So we're motivated to engage in those behaviors to achieve those things that we want to achieve. Just a simple example of learned motivation is the diamond ring. Girls have learned from society that if their boyfriend is serious about the relationship, then they'll buy them a ring. So there's motivation to get your boyfriend to buy you a ring. Obviously this is not a biological motive. You might be able to look at it in terms of a little bit of a stimulus motive, but it's a learned motive. This is something that is picked up from the society in which you live. Okay, let's flip over to another concept, and I want to step over here and put an overhead on the board. You can actually see this on page 345, and this is the inverted U model of motivation or arousal and performance. But so you can take a look at it. Let me put it on the overhead over here. So let me step aside and move up, and then we'll talk about it. Yeah. Oh, here we go. Okay. I was having trouble. So we're getting that to come up. Okay. What I'd like for you to know, for test purposes, is that psychologists have recognized there's a relationship between arousal level, and we can sort of equate arousal level to the level of motivation, and performance. And this is referred to as the inverted U. Now, this is very important to me, because I'm interested in sports psychology. I've actually taught sports psychology and have participated in sporting activities throughout my life. But if you're an athlete, you can probably identify with this. But all of us, are affected by what is sort of described by this inverted U. For test purposes, what I'd like for you to know is that, as you can see, we're looking at the relationship between performance and arousal, motivation over here. And at low motivation, low levels of arousal, look what we have with performance. And I think that, if you think about your own life, even if you're an athlete or even if you're not an athlete, in cases where you're asked to perform, maybe if you're a musician or academic performance or whatever the level of performance is that you're asked to do, if your level of arousal motivation is low, then it's very likely that your performance is going to be low also. So for test purposes, I'd like for you to start there, to recognize and be able to let me know that that if there are low levels of arousal, then we can expect low levels of performance. Now, look what happens. This is a correlation, and we've talked about correlation before. It's certainly not a cause and effect. But as the level of arousal goes up, and we're looking at the level of arousal going up this way, on this axis, as the level of arousal goes up, look what happens to performance. Obviously, the level of performance is going up. So this is one of the things I'd like for you to capture for test purposes, that as the level of arousal starts going up, then we can expect an increase in the level of performance. Now, what happens? Up to a certain point, and I'd like for you to recognize this optimum performance level, or this optimum level of arousal. So there's an optimal level of arousal, or optimal level of performance, that leads to this optimum performance level. And where is it? It's sort of at a medium level of arousal or motivation. Then what happens if the level of arousal or motivation continues to go up? Then you can see that the level of performance begins to come down. And this is why we call it the inverted U, because if you look at the graph, it is like an upside down U. Now this, that's, again, as I said, this has very important implications for sports. Some of you, I know, have participated in sports, and you can probably identify with this, that if you go into a game and you're not very motivated and aroused, then your level of performance is probably going to be pretty low. You're going to be flat. If you get a little bit more motivated, a little bit more aroused, either yourself or your coach sort of gets you more motivated or aroused, then what happens? Your level of performance, is likely to go up. But what if you go into the game and we're into the performance. Let's say it's a speech, and you want to do really well, and you're so hyper. You know, you have gotten so motivated and so aroused that your level of motivation or arousal is over here. What does the inverted U say? It says that your level of performance is going to, once again, go down. So you're going to have a fairly low level of performance. So this has very practical implications for athletes, for anyone who's asked to perform. That this inverted U suggests that at low levels, and this is what I'd like for you to capture for test purposes, at low levels of arousal motivation, we can expect low levels of performance. As the level of arousal motivation increases, then we begin to see an increase in the level of performance, but only up to this sort of medium level of arousal motivation that leads to the best or optimum performance. Once the level of arousal or motivation continues to increase, then we become anxious. Then we begin, the level of performance begins to drop. So again, for test purposes, what I'd like for you to do is sort of capture the essence of this particular model. Now, in the book, you'll be able to see that there is a difference in what's referred to as a complex task or simple task, but you don't have to do that for test purposes. Just know this basic relationship that is described and explained by the inverted U theory. Now, let's go to a big one. And if Jacob was here, I would be turning to Jacob right now. But Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Let's take a look at this, and you can see this in your textbook on page 348. But so we can all take a look at it together. And what I've done is sort of got another sort of model of Maslow's hierarchy. Now, what I'd like for you to do for test purposes is to be able to sort of talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs in terms of each level of need. And we're going to talk about each one of these levels, and then we're going to do an analysis. And I'll sort of take you through an analysis here in just a bit. But what Maslow said is that when you look at motivation, you can sort of break it down into different levels of need. And as already mentioned when we were talking about biological motivation, the most basic type of motivation is based on biological or physiological needs. So you can see, and we've already talked about this when we looked at biological needs, what we mean here is the need for air, food, drink, shelter, warmth, sleep, all those things that we have to survive. So for test purposes, recognize that the most basic level, the one that is at the base of Maslow's hierarchy, is what we refer to as biological or physiological needs. Now we need to introduce the theory, and please don't forget the theory for test purposes. The theory says that in order to move up to a level higher, you need to have satisfied, and we can sort of say reasonably satisfied, the level down below. So in this case, before a person is motivated to move up to to be aware of their safety needs, then they would have needed to reasonably take care of their biological or physiological needs. So the next level then is safety. Now, as I've told you over and over again, I don't want you to use circular definitions, but in this case, this is one where I will accept a circular definition, because what's the best way to describe safety needs? Safety and security needs. It's the need to feel safe and secure. Now you can say, protection, security, order, law, limits, and stability. But for test purposes, I will accept that you just described the safety and security level as our need to feel safe and secure. Now, once again, don't forget the theory. When would Maslow predict that a person moves up to be motivated to satisfy their safety needs after they have reasonably satisfied their biological or physiological needs? And just to give an example of this, a person who would be more likely to do something that is dangerous, to get food, a person who is hungry or a person who is not hungry. Obviously, it's the person who's hungry, because that person would not be aware of their safety needs, because they would be focused on their physiological needs. A person who was not hungry, then they would have already moved up to an awareness of their safety needs. So, they would not, be likely to do something dangerous to get food, because that's not the level of need they're focusing on at that particular time. Now, once again, moving up the hierarchy, and as I said, for test purposes, what I'd like for you to be able to do is to describe each one of these levels in Maslow's hierarchy. What do we mean by each one of these levels? And also, don't forget the theory. We're going to talk about the theory throughout. Now, you can sort of, just sort of make one statement about the theory, and I'll repeat that in just a little bit. But the theory suggests, once again, before we become aware of and move up to be motivated by our love and belongingness needs, that we would have reasonably had to have satisfied our biological or physiological needs, our safety needs. Now we move up to our belongingness and love needs, or love and belongingness needs.